Welcome, welcome. If you are coming in live or if you are watching the recording later, I'm really excited to continue this conversation about authenticity. I love that y'all are interested in this. I think this is a really important topic to explore, and there is a lot to explore when it comes to authenticity. So, yeah, I'm really excited to dive in a little deeper today. Okay, and I've got some new technology pieces I'm going to be piloting. We're going to try some stuff out. Um, yeah, so we got some good stuff planned. But let's just take a moment to drop in, even if you're listening to this while multitasking, if you can just tune into your experience as human in the world right now, because this is part of when we talk about authenticity. This is part of what it is. It's like getting real with who we are and getting real with where we're at. So, how are you? It is really warm where I'm at right now, so I got to spend a lot of time outside today. I was able to do some of that reflection myself. And yeah, I'm feeling really excited to dive in. There's a lot happening in the world right now, which is part of why I think it's important for us to check in with how we are so we can treat ourselves with some compassion and some gentleness. And um, it's really easy in society today to just sort of push through and be busy and go about business as usual when things don't feel like normal out in the world. There can be a lot of pressure to just kind of keep going and not think and not reflect too deeply. So, giving ourselves a moment to think about that, giving ourselves a moment to turn inwards and really see how we're doing. What do we need? Do we need to go outside and be with the birds for a little bit? I can see a bird feeder out of my window right now, and there's two bluebirds that are sitting there right now. Nature's a really powerful tool of getting us back in touch with ourselves in a deeper way. What are the things that help you? Might be good to think about as we're having this conversation. So, what I want to do today in this deep dive down into the realms of authenticity is to unpack the roots a little bit and to think about how do we go deeper with ourselves when it comes to exploring authenticity? How do we get below the surface? Because very often authenticity can be, we can keep it at a surface level. People use that word a lot, and it can be easy to just sort of scratch the surface of what it means to be authentic without really going down into some of the deeper pieces. So that's the conversation I want to have today. And I want to start with this simple question of what are the things that stop you from being authentic? What are the things that block you from feeling like you can be in your full self expression? Your biggest, boldest self? What are the things that prevent you from feeling comfortable in doing that? And if you're having some ideas and some thoughts and things that are coming to mind right now, the next invitation, the next question to take that down a level deeper is what's underneath that? What are you afraid of? What are we afraid of? And then a way we can keep going down into that exploration is to continue asking ourselves, okay, what's underneath that? What's underneath that fear? So, for example, something that I know I've grappled with and coming to terms with my own experience with authenticity in the world is people will judge me, right? And that's a pretty common one. That might have come up as you were thinking about this too. People will judge me. And when I ask myself, for me, what's underneath that? What am I afraid of if people judge me? What's the part of that that feels painful to me? And for me, that's people will think I'm bad. And that goes back to childhood, right? And when I think about that, okay, so if people think I'm bad, what's underneath that? What's the fear? Can I unpack that a level deeper? Why is that really a problem? If someone thinks I'm bad, why does that bother me? Why does that get under my skin? Why does that make me control my actions? Why do I care so much what they think of me? And it's oh, okay, so I'm wrapping up my worth in whether people think I'm good. So I'm defining my worth by other people's opinions of me. And again, we can keep doing this. And very often what we'll find is that it's childhood stuff, right? I was raised in a way that taught me to define my worth based on other people's opinion of me. That's very true. That's very common in this culture. But when I'm aware of that, when I understand some of those mechanisms, I can choose. I can make better conscious choices about like how do I actually want to respond to that? Do I actually want to dictate my reactions and my responses out of fear, out of an expectation, out of a belief that other people get to define who I am? No, I don't want to live that way. I want to feel worthy about who I am as a person regardless of what somebody else's opinion of me is. So it doesn't magically erase it and make it go away. But when we do this kind of unpacking, when we go down into some of the roots of what we're feeling, it allows us more clarity. It allows us more choice. We get to respond differently. We get to choose differently in terms of how we want to behave, how we want to believe about ourselves. What thoughts do we want to continue allowing to spin around in our head? So I want to take this deeper. And as I mentioned, I have a technology piece to share with you. Okay. So let's talk about authenticity. Let's take this a level deeper. Authenticity. When I looked up, like, what does that word actually mean? If we go down into the Latin origins of it, we can like trace it all the way back here. You see in this little screen, we can trace it down Greek ancestral lines, Latin, French origination lines. But essentially, what it speaks to is a real, entitled to acceptance as factual sense of self. So that we are real and that we are entitled to acceptance as factual. And isn't that kind of cool in and of itself? That like who we are innately is factual. Who we are innately is real. Without all the other stuff, authenticity is about being who we really are. So I want to take that roots example that we talked about and apply it from a broader lens. So part of what we're doing in this space, part of what brings us all here, is to bring like a socio-political edge and a cultural framework of understanding of our human experience. That's what Queer Utopia is in part about. It's about finding belonging, it's about finding acceptance, it's about celebrating difference and diversity in who we truly are. But at the core of it, it's about culture. It's about co-creating a different kind of culture that isn't replicating the same sorts of social dynamics that prevent us from feeling like we can be authentic in the first place. So the framework of a tree, this like unpacking the roots narrative, like the example that we just did a second ago, is a key way that we can do this. It's a key way that we can think about and understand what does it mean to be influenced by culture. And when we think about what blocks our authenticity, again, I want to call you back to those questions, those any memories you might have of the way you answered those questions, or let's just ask it again now, like what blocks your authenticity? What are some of the things that prevent you from feeling like you can be your biggest, boldest, freest self? Here are some of the examples that I thought of. Our worth is wrapped up in other people's approval, like the example I shared about myself. Appearancism, placing a lot of value on how we look, the way that things look. Insecurity and shame can block us from our authenticity. Feeling like who we are is not okay at our core, feeling like we need to hide parts of who we are. Codependency, being wrapped up in other people's experience of us. Comparison and competition with other people. And then fear, right? Like a fear of criticism, a fear of judgment. And we can unpack that and get to some of these other pieces. What's underneath that fear? A lot of times it's that worth is approval piece. But all these are very interconnected. So all these are things that I would say are symptoms that block authenticity. They're the surface level stuff that gets in the way. And if we don't unpack them deeper, it can be easy for us to stay wrapped up in those pieces. What I want to do, though, is to take it deeper. Because when we understand the roots of these things, we can understand different ways of responding. And to take it all the way back to culture, I want to talk about colonialism. Now, this could be like a whole separate video in and of itself, but colonialism is the cultural fabric that we have here in the United States. It's interesting because colonialism is something that is often talked about and taught about in our education systems as though it was like something that happened in the past, as though it was an event that happened, like white Europeans came and colonized the United States and now the United States exists. That's not really the reality. Colonialism is not a past event. Colonialism is a structure. Colonialism is a framework. Colonialism is a culture. And it's the culture that was brought here when white Europeans came and stole the land from the indigenous populations that had lived here. Colonialism was the culture that they brought. So colonialism is the culture that created all the systems and structures around us. Colonialism, saying it again and again and again, but like colonialism is the culture that indoctrinated us. It's the way that it's how we've been trained to see the world around us. It is the cultural fabric that exists. It's like we're the fish in the fishbowl, and the fish in the fishbowl thinks that the water in that fishbowl is the world. That fish in the fishbowl is not aware that there's broader realities beyond that. That's what culture can be like. And that's what colonialism is for us in this country. For those of us who have been born and raised in the United States from the start, that's our fishbowl. That's our fishbowl reality. It's how we shape the world, and we're not even aware that we're swimming in that water. It's what we've come to take as normal. Again, we can do a whole nother deep dive on colonialism, and we will, and I would love to, because I think it's a really interesting and important topic to explore. But I want to talk about some of the specific roots of colonialism. So I have colonialism represented by the water in this image because that's the environmental conditions in which the tree of authenticity, the tree of us, the tree of our reality grew from. Colonialism was the soil, colonialism was the water that shaped everything else. So when the roots of this tree developed, they grew in colonialism. They grew into these pieces down here. Consumerism, the American dream, culture of fear, weaponization of difference. All of these are symptoms of colonialism. All of these are aspects of culture that developed as a result of the seed of culture having been planted in colonialist and in a colonialist environment. So consumerism, the prioritization of spending money, of consumption, mass production. We've been so trained to think that's normal, right? Like just think about the way that we grew up on commercials. Now when I watch commercials, I'm like shocked and alarmed and disturbed. But as a kid, it was just normal. As a kid, it made me want those things, right? And that's what colonialism was designed to do. That's what consumerism was designed to do. The American dream teaching us that there's like this cookie cutter way of being a human. There's this ideal dream that we should all be striving for, that we should all reach for. The white picket fence. It's very one size fits all. And so what happens if that's not our dream? Well, we don't fit in. We're indoctrinated in this culture to believe in the American dream as like the epitome of happiness. That was true for me in so much of my experience. I sought to create a life that was in line with the American dream because I thought that's what would lead me to happiness. And when I achieved it and when I had it, I wasn't happy at all. It wasn't what I wanted at all because I'm not cookie cutter. I'm not one size fits all. And so many of us are not. So maybe you're already thinking about how some of these roots end up rippling up into the rest of the tree and creating some of those symptoms at the top. Keep thinking about that. Education system and Indigenous boarding schools. Ooh, this is one that I feel really passionately about. And you might be wondering, like, why would I put Indigenous boarding schools on here? Because again, those ended, right? Like that era is over. But actually, our education systems very strongly mirror the way that Indigenous boarding schools operated. So Indigenous boarding schools were what were used when colonialism first came onto this land, and it was used as a cultural weapon against Indigenous populations to remove their culture and to indoctrinate them with colonialist culture, with white European culture, with white European value systems and ways of thinking about the world. Indigenous people's hair was chopped off. They were physically punished. They weren't allowed to speak their native languages. They weren't allowed to engage in their spiritual practices. There was a cookie cutter conveyor belt sort of approach to education that was used in these schools. And they were specifically designed, like the saying was, kill the Indian, save the man. They were specifically designed to kill Indigenous culture and save by implementing white European colonialist culture. This is something that I've studied for part of my PhD program. And it was really fascinating and interesting to think about because modern education systems today do the same thing. I have a YouTube video on this, an open letter to academia, on my YouTube channel if you're interested in understanding a little bit more of how this plays out, because it's very similar. Education systems don't just teach us math and English and how to get by in the world. Education systems teach us culture. Education systems teach us ways to be and not be, ways to think and not think, what's allowed and what's not allowed, what's professional, what's civilized. Education systems continue to be a major way that we get pressure to fit into that one size fits all cookie cutter mold. Along with this, there's a huge culture of fear and a weaponization of difference in this culture that's been going on again since the days of colonialism first started on this land. There's a lot of ways that media teaches us to fear other people, fear other races, fear people who are different from us, fear people from other countries. These mechanisms are ongoing. So I could go on and on and on. This is part of what I teach, and so I get really passionate about it. But let's talk about like how does the stuff, because that's heavy, right? Like the stuff at the roots, like that's pretty heavy. That's cultural fabric stuff. It's not something that we can easily go in and address. I can't like wave a magic wand and erase the deeply entrenched vision of an American dream that's been in this country for hundreds of years. Like we don't have a lot of control over the roots of this tree. Where we do have control is the way that the roots, the stuff at the roots, trickles up into the rest of the tree. So the colonialist rot at the roots, we might say, is what trickles up into the rest of this tree and ends up creating all these different symptoms that block us from our authenticity. And how does it do that? Well, I want to focus on these three pieces here: chronic dysregulation, conformity and peer pressure, and childhood and interpersonal trauma. And I want to start with conformity and peer pressure, because that's a huge way, and it's very directly linked to some of those pieces I was just talking about. That's a huge way we continue to replicate blocking authenticity. So we're taught through education systems, we're taught through social media, we're taught through indoctrination that comes with consumerist culture, the commercials we're raised on, all the billboards we see in the streets, all the stores that pop up constantly trying to get our attention, even the colors they use in grocery store to attract our attention to different brands and different stuff that we want to buy that's going to, feed us, not just feed our hunger, but like feed other parts of us too. Feed our soul. Like that's part of what consumerist culture does. You need this thing to be happy. So the American dream is part of that as well. And so all these pieces together, we end up perpetuating them on one another. It creates this culture of conformity where we're given this fishbowl understanding of what it means to be human, and then we expect everybody else to follow along. There was a story that I've heard, and I'm like actually not sure if it's 100% true. I haven't fact checked it, but I've heard that crabs or lobsters, maybe crabs, and it's kind of a terrible, morbid story too, but it's an example of what conformity looks like. What I've heard is that if you boil crabs, and one crab is starting to like crawl out of the bucket, the other crabs will grab that crab and pull it back down into the bucket. Again, haven't fact checked it, but that's what I've heard. And conformity really does work in a similar way. Conformity thrives on everybody wanting to be the same. And so there can be this reaction when somebody goes to break the mold of like trying to pull that person back in. Something I've been hearing in my realms lately is like the example of if somebody makes the decision that they're not going to drink anymore. And if drinking alcohol is something that your friend group is used to and that's part of how you socialize, when somebody makes that decision that I'm not going to drink anymore, there can be that kind of like peer pressure of like, why? And that's weird. And people want you to stay. There's a tendency to like want people to stay the same way, to stay comfortable, to stay normal, to stay. When I worked in child welfare, there was a saying that we used to say, which is, the hell we know is better than the heaven we don't know. And so there's that kind of a sentiment. We want to stay comfortable. There can be a tendency for groupthink to want to stay comfortable even when it's not comfortable, even when it's not okay, and to avoid the unknown, to avoid the opportunity on the other side. There can be a fear of what we don't understand. And so conformity can be a huge way that reinforces all these different aspects of authenticity. Peer pressure can be a huge way if we give into that, if we allow that, if we wrap our worth up with what our peers think of us and what they expect of us. Childhood and interpersonal trauma is another way too. So much of this stuff, the shame, insecurity, worth as approval, codependency, fear, like so many of these pieces, if we keep asking that question of why, what's underneath this, why, what's underneath this, why, what's underneath this, it takes us back to childhood. It takes us back to stuff that we learned when we were 0 to 3 or in elementary school from our parents, from our peer groups, times when we felt like we were not loved unless we behaved a certain way, times we didn't get approval, times we might not have gotten our needs met unless we behaved a certain way. And that creates stories within us, that creates deeply embedded subconscious narratives about how to stay safe and what it means and who we should be. And so if we're not aware of that, if we're not aware of like that's an experience I was taught in childhood, that's a story I learned in childhood, if we're not able to separate from that story, we're going to keep subconsciously repeating it. So if we don't look at some of these pieces, if we don't look at like why is our worth, our sense of self-worth wrapped up in other people's approval of us, if we don't take the time to unpack that, we're most likely going to continue subconsciously expecting that, and therefore adjusting our actions and our behaviors and stifling our authenticity to try and get that approval from other people, not even knowing that it's because that's what our parents did, or that's what teachers expected of us, or that's what our first best friend pressured us into. And so the benefit of recognizing that it stems from childhood is that we can start to make different decisions. We can recognize like, okay, that's what I had to do for survival when I was a kid. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have other people to care for me. I had to do what was expected of me. I had to survive. I didn't have the mental capacity to understand what was happening. And now I'm an adult. I'm not in that situation anymore. We can start to separate ourselves from our stories. Maybe back then I learned that I had to fit in, I had to conform in order to get my needs met. Now, as an adult, I can make a different decision. Now, as an adult, I can meet my needs. I can choose people that love me for who I authentically am instead of expecting me and basing their love conditionally on who they want me to be. So we got to weave apart that web that's like very enmeshed in many, many, many of us. It's been very enmeshed in me, but we can start to weave apart that web a little bit so we can separate our adult selves and our adult choices from survival things that we had to go through and function and move through as kids. And the final piece here is chronic dysregulation. And this kind of connects to those other pieces too, because if we grow up learning that we have to be a certain way in order to be loved, in order to get our needs met, there's going to be part of us that has never really felt safe. And so if we are someone who like often feels overwhelmed by anxiety, if we are someone who, you know, in that heat of the moment when we're interacting with somebody and like we automatically people please and we automatically slip into being who they expect us or want us to be instead of who we authentically are, like that's wrapped up in chronic dysregulation. That's like a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. That's what that means. It's an automated response that's like self-sacrificing in a way to try and appease the other person. And so part of it is unpacking those childhood stories and understanding how conformity and peer pressure have played a role. But part of it is also learning how to regulate our system and help our body understand that we're safe now. And what does regulation mean? Regulation means helping our body understand we're safe, helping our body calm down. There's some work that we have to do up here in the mind. We got to do some of that story unweaving, but then we also have to be able to figure out what are the practices that help us feel calm in our body. Being with nature, deep breathing, meditation, yoga. All these are really, really important. Journaling. All these are really important practices that have helped me with my chronic dysregulation. They've helped me heal from chronic anxiety and depression. When I stayed wrapped up in the world of what other people expected me to be, I was in constant dysregulation. I was constantly dysregulated. I was chronically anxious. I was chronically depressed. I was functioning, so people on the outside might not have known that, but inside that's what I was feeling. And it was very interconnected with a lack of authenticity. It was very interconnected with a lack of connection to true self. So all these are pieces that when we think about this question of what's blocking our authenticity, we can take it really deep. And I call this like a mind hack, this sort of framework, this sort of way of thinking about different problems that we're experiencing. And we can apply this. I use this in the classroom for years. We can apply this to any topic under the sun, any social problem, racism, patriarchy. We can apply this to any interpersonal issue we're experiencing, shame, or a specific kind of trigger. The benefit of this, and again, why I call it a mind hack, is because it allows us to break out the pieces a little bit. It allows us to get a bigger picture understanding of like what's really happening here. Because so often we stay wrapped up in the branches and just stuck in the shame and stuck in the insecurity and trying to, it's like if we're dealing with a tree that's sick, if we're dealing with a tree that's diseased and we're trying to pull like leaves off of that tree in order to heal the tree, we're just going to keep pulling leaf and pulling leaf and pulling leaf and dealing, putting band-aid after band-aid after band-aid on the problem and getting nowhere, because that's not where the problem really actually is. We got to go deeper in the tree. So it's the same thing when we're having these kinds of conversations. We got to get ourselves out of the branches and go deeper. And so this way of thinking about reality, thinking about the things that we're experiencing, thinking about the ways that we are and the ways that we want to be, the benefit of it is that it opens up more knowledge, it opens up more awareness, it opens up more choice, and that gives us more power. So what are the takeaways here? Bringing our roots to light. Again, this is an activity that helps us understand what and whose truth are we really believing. Because at the end of the day, we want to match, like, what are our conscious values? What are our values now as adults? Who do we want to be? We don't have to be who our parents trained us to be. We don't have to be what our peer group pressured us into being. We don't have to be what colonial society and our culture taught us we should be. Like, we get to choose now. And so when we know what our values are, when we can identify what our values are, it's a process of matching our subconscious beliefs about reality to those values and to weave apart those stories that keep it all messed up and murked up together. So using this activity to unpack the roots of where are these expectations, where are these beliefs coming from, is a key way that we can do that. This also allows us to nurture the roots. We can shift, again, like I just talked about, we can shift from the stuff in the branches, spinning out at the top of the tree. We can shift down deeper into the tree and look at what's really going on here. I don't need to just like keep talking about shame and focusing on shame and staying wrapped up in like this particular aspect of my experience. I can go a little deeper. And when I go a little deeper, I can understand like where did this come from in the first place? And I can respond with love. Okay, this came from an early childhood experience. This came from my kid self, my 2-year-old, 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 10-year-old self, learning that in order to receive love, I couldn't be who I authentically was. I had to be what so-and-so expected me to be. Then I get the opportunity to go back and like love that part of me. Can I go inside and look at that child and like recognize and tell myself, like even verbally tell myself out loud, like you were just perfect as you were, and this is what you deserved. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be loved and not as you authentically were. What happened to you wasn't right, and it doesn't have to keep happening. We can go back and give those pieces love. The parts of our body that feel dysregulated, that get activated when we're in social situations and we feel that pressure to conform, to be what other people might expect us to be, what we think they might expect us to be. We can love that part of us. We can turn towards that part of us. We can take ourselves out of the branches and go deeper into the tree and recognize like, okay, I'm feeling dysregulated. How can I love that part of me? How can I give that part of me what it needs? And that's what it's about, going deeper into that tree. It's giving the depths of us, what do we really need here? How can we feed ourselves that? And then the other part of nurturing our roots is to consciously cultivate our reality. Because like I said, colonialism is the fishbowl that we swim in. It's the water that surrounds us. And if we just autopilot through life in this culture and stay in normative aspects of society and keep doing what everybody else is doing, we're going to keep getting that same conditioning that disconnected us from our authenticity in the first place. So these are questions we can ask ourselves, like what messages are we programming into our subconscious reality? What TV shows are we watching? What news stations are we listening to? What media, what forms of movies? What other things are we consuming that are feeding our subconscious vision and our subconscious understanding of reality? Like, here's a personal example. I've been watching the show Sex and the City lately, and it's like a guilty pleasure of mine that dates back to, that was what I grew up with in. So it's like a throwback to my older teenager and young adult self. And there's something that feels really good about like going back and rewatching some of those old episodes. And I'm also aware that it's like a terrible way to program myself about the world. It's not at all how I want to. I do not at all want to see the world through the eyes of Sex in the City. It's a very toxic way to think about relationships and men and the purpose of life. Like, talk about consumer culture. Sex in the City is hugely like that. So it's not all black and white. I'm not. And I'm using that as a personal example to just like humanize this too, because we make our choices, but, and I'm choosing to watch it right now, but we can still, when I watch it, I can watch it through the lens of recognizing like, oh, this is not aligned with my value system. This is not how I want to see the world. We can be consciously aware that what we take into our field feeds our vision of reality. And so how can we have some boundaries around that? And how can I recognize if and when watching that kind of a TV show is like programming the way that I'm seeing the world? Like, I know that's not a show that's going to resonate with me forever as I continue on my path of authenticity, because it's not in value alignment. So those are some of the tough questions we have to ask ourselves. Like, what are we going to expose ourselves to? What are we really willing to expose ourselves to? And importantly with that is like, what environments and people are we spending time with? And that's kind of where I'm counterbalancing things right now, is I don't spend time with people who think like Sex and the City characters think. So I have some separation there. But, if my friends that I was spending time with in my social environments mirrored that kind of reality, and that's what I was watching on TV, and that's the kind of music that I was listening to, like, that's how we subconsciously program ourselves in ways that really are going to disconnect us from our authenticity. So we can counterbalance, right? Like the music that I listen to, the social spaces I hang out in, the people I spend time with, the people I connect deeply with, all those are people who are in value alignment with me. So it's not black and white. It's not about being perfect here, but it is about being aware that the way that we spend our moment to moment daily reality, it's gonna bring us, that's what programs us. It's gonna bring us into a way of seeing the world. That's what culture is. So how can we consciously cultivate our own culture? How can we live the way that we want to live? And create that kind of environment around us? How can we consciously choose now that we're adults and we have that power of choice? So there's two things that I want to leave you with here as we conclude, and I would love to hear any comments or any feedback for those who are watching. If you're watching the recording, anything that's coming to mind, any reflections you're having from this process, any questions, anything you want to dive in deeper to, I really welcome all of that. This is a co-created conversational space, and I'm interested in going where all of us are interested in going. So know that I welcome your feedback, welcome your questions, welcome your engagement. That really feeds me as part of this process too. And the two things that I really want to leave you with, the first is a reminder, and that's to learn from nature. Like, nature doesn't give a fuck. That's what I love about nature. When I was out walking around this morning, I was just observing. I was observing the birds and the wind and the trees, and like, they don't give a fuck, right? Like, there was a bird that was being loud as hell and just, and there was no embarrassment. There's no shame around that bird of like, oh, maybe I'm going to inconvenience people. And like, maybe the trees think I'm being too loud and I might be annoying. And, this isn't how I'm supposed to act. This isn't how my parents raised me to act. Like, nature just is. Nature is permission to be loud and audacious and bold and just as you naturally are, right? Like that definition of authenticity, as you naturally, innately are. So we can learn from nature to give ourselves permission to be as bold, as big, as unbridled as we naturally, authentically are. So much of this process of of tapping, maybe all of this process of tapping into our authenticity is about pulling apart the crap and the shit that's been placed upon us that is like I'm seeing it as like muddy gunk that has stifled who we truly are. It's the social conditioning, it's the peer pressure, it's the conformity, it's the social trauma. All that stuff has like blocked us out from the innate version of us that we truly are, that we factually are. And so coming back to authenticity is about shedding that stuff. It's about pushing that stuff off. It's about clearing that stuff out, getting that stuff out of the way. Because really, at the end of the day, it's about being who we are. Because the reminder here is that we are nature. Humans are nature. And so just like that loud ass bird that I was listening to this morning, we get to be that too. That's what our soul, that's what our spirit is calling us to do. That's what our innate natural essence is. And so how can we give ourselves permission to be that? And looking at nature is a great example. Looking at nature is fantastic permission to be bold because it's all part of it. It's all needed. It's all welcome. It's all deserving. And the other part that I want to tie in here is that it's not just about you. Like, it's enough that it's about us, because being authentic is part of being happy and healthy and being a human who is happy and healthy in the world. So that's important, and like that's enough to do it just for that reason. But if you need more of a reason, because this is something that has really helped me step into my authenticity, it's not just about you. Because the thing about authenticity is it's contagious. Conformity is contagious. Authenticity is contagious too. And so we can continue to spread either one of those things. We can spread conformity by stifling ourselves and not giving ourselves true permission. Because if we don't give ourselves true permission to be who we are, we can't give other people true permission to be who they are. So we can spread conformity by blocking that expression from within ourselves, because other people can sense that, right? Like other people can sense when we're not being authentic. When we do that whole Midwestern nice thing, like, hi, how are you? I'm good. How are you? I'm good. Like, we're feeding into that culture of conformity. We're feeding into that culture of like, we're normalizing not being real, normalizing not being authentic. That's the culture we're spreading. So we can choose to instead, we can choose to spread authenticity. When we show up as we authentically are, we give other people permission to do the same. We become possibility models. We become examples. When we create a culture of authenticity, when like we give ourselves permission to be who we are, we're giving other people that same permission. So it's not just about us, because it's the kind of culture that we're feeding into, and it's the kind of energy that we're spreading in everyday interactions with other people. So if it's not enough for you to do this for yourself, like just imagine that you're doing this for other people. Embracing and expressing authenticity is a socio-political act, and it's a revolutionary act. It's part of how we take back our power from colonialism. It's part of how we combat oppression. It's part of how we create a more just, a more kind, a more compassionate, a more holistic society and culture around us. So at the end of the day, it's about all of us. It's about nature. It's about creating a world for all of us. It's about creating a space where we can all belong. Because when we truly believe that about ourselves, that's what allows us to create a space of belonging for everyone else too. All right, that is what I've got for you today. It is a very sunny day, so I get that there's not much engagement on the live today. But thanks for watching this, and thanks for the conversation. And yeah, please feel free. I invite you to leave any comments, and I look forward to continuing these explorations as we go. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you soon.